He's our strength and conditioning coach at ACTAS, and it's kindly agreed to come and talk a little bit about his area of expertise and strength training for runners. I think it's really good that we've got people that are willing to come and share that knowledge, and I appreciate everybody coming and with the intent to learn something new, and depending on how we go for time as well, I'll talk a little bit about my beliefs in core strength, which is building on what Simon's doing and what we're planning on doing within the ACTAS program, which I'd love to read more of. So, thank you.
Well, firstly, thanks everyone for having me on. So a little bit about myself. Obviously, as I said, I'm the SSC coach for the rowing program out of ACTAS. A few people in the room already know me. I've been with the rowing program for about 4 years now, but I've been an SSC with ACTAS for nearly 15 years, working across various sports in my time. But previous to that, I was lowly PT, working in a public gym. But no, I love that part too. So, but my drive was always working high performance sport, and I feel really privileged to work with a lot of really high level athletes and coaches and staff across the board. Hence why I came and given this chat to everyone tonight. A bit about the presentation. If I go through the slides really quickly, we'll be here really short amount of time. What I like to do is I'd like this to be a little bit more open discussion and questions. So please, at any time, if anyone's got any questions or wants to expand on anything that I put up here, please do. I'll go through the slides. I'll talk about what my views are. So everything I talk about won't be on the slides, but they're just more primers for me to remember what I want to talk about. I'll go through the process of what I've done previously, and then also what we're looking to do moving forward into our next cycle. So, any questions before we start? No? Good start. All right, excellent. I guess for me, the first question is always, what makes a boat go fast? Now, we can make every boat go as fast as I can imagine that one is going. I don't know how fast that one actually was going, but
Obviously.
I'd like to try and pull up the pictures. Is my role as the SSC coach and anyone working in strength training is how can I help any particular athlete or athletes make their boat go faster? I've just been reintroduced to the animations and transitions on PowerPoint, so it's chock full of them tonight. That is the one that's made me the most happy to have that one transition tonight. So basically, the main thing that I look at it from a point of view, and I think I like to look at it this way because I think this translates fairly well to the way everyone in rowing looks at making the boat go fast. Is that we're looking at the power output, which is typically measured in watts. Okay, but the important part I like to look at is what we use to get to power. So simply put, we're looking at force times velocity. And if we extend that out, we're going, okay, well to get force, we need mass times acceleration. Then we push that out using the other side of the equation, velocity is distance over time. Then to get force, we know that mass, we're going to be using a given load, but to get the acceleration, we need velocity 1 minus velocity 2 divided by time. Finally, to create momentum, which is mass times velocity. So to get the boat to move fast, we need to be powerful, we need to create momentum. We're trying to overcome deceleration of both the athlete, the water, and any other friction that's been created through weather. And by doing that, we're trying to improve our ability to accelerate with a given mass that we're trying to do. Now, whether that's a single, double, or the 28, 24? 24? I didn't actually count it. First, what is it? So, these are the things that are going to make it from a physical standpoint. Now, obviously, what I'm talking about is purely aimed at the physical standpoint. There are a lot of other elements that go into making a boat fast, such as the mental capacity of the athlete, the conditions outside, and one of the more important ones, obviously, is the technique of the rower, okay, and how well they can row. Okay? That will come into play a little bit more as I get down through this slide. So I guess the biggest thing is that for me, we want these athletes to be strong, because one of the biggest things that's an outcome for power is the amount of force that each athlete can produce. Okay. Now, this is not a rowing athlete, this is a weightlifting athlete, but I like to bring this picture up whenever we're talking about this, because if I'm talking about squatting, which I believe to be a pretty foundational movement for rowing, in an ideal world, this is where I'd like to see my squats looking somewhat like. Okay? When you work with multiple sports, you have multiple things that you've got to think about how your training will affect the outcome of their sport, but also what their sport actually requires from a positioning standpoint. And rowing to me is one of the biggest ones. Well, it's one of the very few ones where, when we're talking about squatting, is that getting good depth and good range in your squatting is actually vital to performing well in the boat. Okay, because everyone in this room would know what a good stroke looks like and what the positions look like, and we know, and there'll be a picture that comes up as well a little bit later for those that are watching at home. But I digress a little bit and I come back and say, why should we strength train? Again, the first thing I said earlier was, how do we make the boat go fast? We've got to go fast. Okay, at the end of the day, to win, we've got to be the fastest out of the water. That's it. There's no other way around that. So we expand that out. I get a lot of times from coaches, not just in rowing, but across all sorts. Oh, we're going to get stronger and faster. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we've got to go at high speed. And then we've got to, and this gets a little bit off track, but it kind of paints a picture of, when we start to dig down, it starts to get a little bit messy. I start to feel an indescribable urge to traverse at a velocity exceeding the norm. Then we get to the final one, which is, it occurs to me to a state as imperative to that the one who may be myself or another has a strong compulsion to engage in a mode of movement that includes but is not limited to high degree of acceleration, momentum or force, or in which the matter of composing of my body would indeed need to be soon to arrive at the location of great distance of what I currently am.
Say that 5 times faster.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I had to run that one. I didn't even get it exactly right there. But the point that I'm trying to make there is that when you talk about the physical qualities, there's a number of them that are multivariable and interconnected. So it's not just as simple as going, they need to be strong. Okay? It's not as simple as just saying, oh, the boat needs to go fast. It's about how can we train the athletes to express their physical capabilities in the most optimal manner to create speed in the boat. Okay? So we look at strength. Can they apply force through the drop fence? Pretty simple. I think we're all pretty happy with that. Power. To do this explosively. So it's not just a matter of can they produce as much force or lift as much weight as possible. Can they do it in an explosive manner that allows them to increase the velocity of the boat, not just move the boat. Acceleration. So there's also getting the boat to go, but then there's also increasing the boat speed as the water slows it down. So if we're looking at the boat, there's a deceleration obviously from the water, but then there's a deceleration as we come in through from the recovery phase. So we're almost looking at two different decelerations. So we've got to look at our ability to then be able to overcome both of those to accelerate the boat each stroke of attack. Okay? The capacity. So can we produce these qualities over multiple strokes? So this is where I shift away a little bit from going, my job, and I'll get to this a little bit later, but my job is not to make the 200 odd strokes that we do over a 2K race as higher quality. My job is to make that one stroke as higher quality, and then it becomes Wesley's job to make the 200 as high quality as they can possibly be. Yeah? But we start that by building that base capacity and that foundational base in the gym. Stability. This is where it really starts to get, this is where I start to change the way I think and the way I coach the strength training. And this is where it ties into what Wesley was talking about before around the core training and stuff like that. Around at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much weight we lift if we can't connect the body to produce a valuable stroke. Okay? So I can get out there, I can leg press till the cows come home, 400 kilos on the leg press. I'm going to be strong on my legs. I'm going to produce a lot of force. But unfortunately, the oars aren't connected to my legs. They're connected to my hands, which are connected to my arms, which are connected to my trunk. So our ability to connect this whole thing and stay connected. Now, I know when I say connected, every rowing coach that's listening to this right now knows exactly what I'm talking about. But I think that's a really challenging thing to get the athletes in particular to understand. Sometimes it can be challenging to understand what that means in a strength training environment. And so probably the one thing I will mention throughout this presentation is I haven't got a lot of examples in here. But that was part of in regards to like exercises that we do. That's because there's a lot of different ways we can achieve this. But in saying that, I am more than happy to, that's why I brought my laptop, my hard drive. I can go in and we can have a look at some stuff and all that kind of stuff as well if we want to, and sort of the prescription of what I might do. But at the end of the day, that's the last thing I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about, oh, we need to do this exercise or this exercise. It's about how can we achieve these things on here through this, a large range of motion that gives us a greater ability to increase stroke length, but also recruit more motor neurons across those strokes. Okay? So can we not only put more into each stroke and therefore have to do less strokes over the given time, okay? But can we produce the most power within that stroke each and every time? And then again, I'll divert back to Wesley, then he's got to do that over 200 times for you guys, depending on the weight, obviously. But these two are the two most important things, and I think these are the ones that we're probably going to spend a little bit more time, or I'm going to spend a little bit more time at least discussing around where probably most of the coaches in the room or online are probably working in regards to what I would, if I'm looking for athletes coming into our program, these we can build. That is not easy, but it can be done if these foundational ones down the bottom around their ability to connect their movements, remain stable through their movements, and move through a solid range of motion within an effective movement pattern will be the things that I make my job easier when they come to me. Okay? And then off the back of that, we're just trying to build a level of robustness. So basically, we just want to make sure they're not going to break down. We want to keep them on the water. We want to keep them on the erg. We want to keep them rowing. Okay? And just handle and improve their ability to handle the training and the competition. Because as they progress throughout the levels, it gets harder, as every sport does. So rowing is one of the hardest ones as it gets along. Like at the base level, it's still very hard from a physical capacity standpoint. So we need to make sure that we're building a robust athlete that can handle moving through a range of motion in a strong and stable and connected way. So then they can produce strength, power, acceleration over repeated efforts. Okay? Anyone got any questions? Discuss it. That's the other thing too. I don't want anyone to sit here and go, oh, Simon's gospel or whatever. Please, if you've got a question that maybe counters that or you're not sure about something, please ask. Otherwise, it's going to be very boring just listening to me talk, I guarantee you. Anyone?
The increasing the stroke length.
Yeah.
I can't quite see how that relates to the strength training in that I would have thought that would be more a technique training.
Yes, it is. It is a technique-specific thing in regards to increasing the length of the stroke specifically. What more my point is that I want them to be able to still have their strength capabilities through a large range of motion, so that when you lengthen the stroke,
you're getting the same strength throughout the length, you're not dropping off at each end, getting the strength in the middle, say.
Yeah, or you're actually producing more over the longer stroke. So basically we're trying to go, if we can do, so I guess the way to look at it, and probably correct me a little bit, I haven't gone as deep into it as I probably should have yet, But obviously the general Rowing Australia way now is to go long and strong with the strokes. And so we're looking at the stroke rates not being quite as high as what previously they have been. So rather than go, like, I mean, if you've ever seen anyone who's never rowed before, they jump on an erg, what do? They jump on and they go like a bat out of hell, producing no force whatsoever. So yeah, my point is, yeah, like, we obviously want those strokes to be nice and long, more effort per stroke, so they do hopefully less strokes. So yeah, that's probably a little bit obviously miscommunication the way I put that there. Yeah, I won't. Yeah,
I get what you're at.
yeah, perfect. Cool.
I would say though also, like, you know, increasing stroke length is a function of strength. Too, you know, because you actually have to have a degree of strength to be able to come into those positions hot, you know, out to the full range, as well as produce force from that compression. You know, that it's the same thing with Simon, where, as you say, when you were to watch somebody untrained just jump on the ergo and have a go, as they fatigue, what do? They get shorter and shorter and shorter. You know, sorry, Max.
No.
Yeah, but no. So I think I would definitely consider it being, you know, like the you know, it's not the exclusive, but it would be a factor, a component of producing.
It's not me coaching the length, but it's me providing the capacity for Wesley to improve that.
And keep that strength throughout the length that's extended.
Yeah. Like I said, like, my goal is to maybe focus on that one stroke, but our goal is the end is that stroke 200 is from a force producing capacity very similar to stroke 1. Go for it.
Which is, like, I was talking about the squat there, right?
Yeah, well, here we go.
You're hitting depths,
Yes.
right? That you're not getting those angles in the hips, in the knees, and the ankles you are at the calf.
Yep.
Right? So, what is the benefit of that versus, like, just doing box squats where you're actually at the angle that you are? And also, like, sort of add the question to that, like, a lot of rowing, especially when we're racing, is to change direction.
Mm-hmm.
So you think that, like, especially, like, yes, okay, there is aspect of accelerating, but the quickness that the muscle fiber is interacting with is really, really high.
Yep.
And because you're getting really deep, you're starting that, it starts quite slow and then builds. What's the actual benefit of going past?
I love this question.
Yeah.
So many things to unpack here.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, correct me if I missed something, and we have to go back to it.
Yeah.
Everything you said, I agree with, but also disagree with at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we're talking about, let's start with the angles and the lines. Okay. My goal isn't necessarily to specifically replicate exactly what the boat looks like, because there's parts on being in the boat, like you have full plates in the boat.
Yeah.
You don't have those when you strength train. So there's already a change to what we're going to get at. So we've got to think about it a little bit around, when we talk about the range, it's not necessarily that we have to be in the sport-specific position. What I do is I use that as a showcase to show, well, we need to get strength out of it. Now, in the time that I've worked with rowing, the biggest thing that the coaches have come to me and said is that they are weak out of the catch. Okay, so to me, I go, well, we want to increase our force producing capabilities in that range of motion.
Yeah.
Now, if we go back to the angle and the lines point of view, I'd argue that there's another issue there of range of motion. Now, whether that be at the ankle, at the hip, the trunk, whatever that might be, there's a potential that everyone could squat in that line. Now, what you would say though is that the reason that you can only go to a box squat in those lines is because you're not creating enough space for the hip. Now, this is not true for every rower, but most rowers will then open up their knees a little bit when they start to get into a deeper catch, if they don't have that range of motion. To the other side of it, if we're only doing box squats, we're only going to be producing force in that range. Now, you're 100% right, yeah, like, it's a good range. You still need force in that range. But if you think about where we actually want the force to be producing from, it's closer into that deeper knee flexion, deeper hip flexion. Yeah. So if I can make them stronger in that range, they're also then going to also be stronger in that shorter range on a box squat anyway. Does that make sense a little bit from that point?
Yeah.
So for me, from a squatting point of view, and this is where I go. That's why it's not just about squatting. That's where things like power cleans, deadlifts, those are now starting to bring those narrower stances into a little. We're bringing into play maybe a little bit more position specific
So
stuff.
it's not so much the angle at which you're driving, it's getting comfortable and stronger in vulnerable positions.
Exactly. And so then going back to what you're talking about from a speed from out of the catch, if I'm remembering what we said correctly, I'd actually almost argue it's probably one of the slowest sports out of that. Like if you're talking about coming in from the recovery phase into the catch, setting and driving out, like most sports are actually coming into those positions like that.
Yeah, sure.
So, but it's coming out of the catch is aggressive and driving phase, and it actually should speed up as they're going.
Yeah.
So I think, and to me, it's less about being quick into the catch. Like you don't want to be bouncing out of that, but we want to be controlled, but under speed and control. And so that's where it becomes a coaching thing. And this is where all of this comes into play of like, I can tell you, oh, here's the exercises we do, here's the sets and reps we do, here's the loads that they do. That doesn't matter if I'm not coaching them in a certain way to do those things. And so, for example, with the squats, I teach them as early as possible. Like I don't let them bounce out of the squat, because the problem when we bounce is we're no longer using the strength capacity, we're using momentum out of the bottom. And so the idea is that if they can control through the bottom, transition, and have that world's slightest pause of controlling it so they're not bouncing, then it's about that rate of force development as it comes back up out of it, So then by the time they hit the same depth as the box squat, they should be moving that quicker. And so the idea then though is that then they're getting that control and that force producing capability when they jump back into the or the erg, that they're able to control into the catch, drive aggressively back out of that.
Yeah, that's right.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Did I miss anything that you brought up in that question?
No,
I think
I think that was it.
Yeah.
I have another question.
No, I don't mind.
Can I add another point? Why muscle connections and developing that? What do you think your role is there? And especially as a coach who coaches a lot of schools.
Can you expand a little bit more on what you mean by that? I think I know what you mean, but
yes. So the athlete's ability to feel when they're engaging their muscles helps them become more coachable, and you can say, okay, when we get a catch, I want you to use this muscle instead of this muscle, and they know what they're doing when you're feeling like I feel the lats squeeze there,
So this is an interesting take because you would have done well to come to a presentation that happened. So the ACA, who's the Strength and Conditioning Association across the country, ran a roadshow just recently where they brought a international licensee coach by the name of Nick Winkleman. If anyone here is probably not, because he's mainly in the rugby. He's American, worked a lot with like NFL combine athletes and that. But his big thing is around cueing and the ability to the language that you use around coaching with athletes. And one of the big things that the theory that he presents with, that's not just his work, but a bunch of people who've worked on that, is that particularly in younger athletes, there's less emphasis on going, feel it in the muscle, feel it in the joint. It's the external cues of drive through the floor. Feel connected through, like lengthen out towards the roof or behind you, like depending on the position you're speaking. So to me, that is the way I would create that mind. So it's not going, oh, you need to, like there's points where you may be bringing that out, but from a generalistic overarching point of view, if we're squatting or deadlifting, I'm not going try and feel it through your glutes as the cueing part. It's the drive through the floor. Drive the floor away. So that I'm getting them, because you find instinctively they should do fairly much the right thing beyond that. Then it's like, okay, where did you feel that? And they might go, actually I really felt that in the glutes. They might not say glutes because they don't know what glutes are, but Does that, yeah, like that's like, but it doesn't mean that's not the way that you don't ever use those cues either. It's actually like hybrids is really good. So it's using those external cues, but then tying it back into that. Yeah. So I think that's really, like the mind muscle thing is really important because you need them to learn, but that's also too, that takes a long, like I've got guys like, I mean, anyone who knows our program knows some of the athletes that are in that. We still are working on those kind of things. And so I think if you're talking about it from a school age point of view, and again, this is where we'll go a little bit with it, is that you can't expect teenagers to understand that they don't understand their body just purely from a walking down the street kind of thing. Like, that's the nature of puberty. They've got no, their arms and legs are everywhere, particularly the guys that are rowing. Like, what's the name? What's the body type of the rowers that we tend to bring in? Big, tall, athletes, you know. So that's why the external cues sometimes work a little bit better because it allows them not to focus on something that they just can't. They can't get a feel for, but they can. But then when you've got those cues starting to work, then you start to do things like, oh, can you feel that through the lats? Can you create that connection? Yeah, and then that's where it starts to go from there. I'm waiting for one for you. No, a little disappointed to be honest with you.
I'm saying the different athletes that respond to different things. Some respond to that, and some do respond to mechanical cues. So like what you're saying, the drive through the floor, stuff like that. When I focus on the drive, push the feet away, make the go forward.
Exactly. And you're right.
Because that'll bounce the boat.
Anything I'm saying anyway is a general over. There's obviously nuances and niches to different athletes, and it all depends on the type of person. There's athletes that they love hearing that little nitty gritty around like the mechanical movement part of it. And then there's some athletes that are like, what the hell are you talking about? And then you go push through the floor and they go, oh, okay, cool, I can do that. Yeah.
And some when recovery, you can say like float out and get it.
Yes, exactly.
Some won't, and then I've reabsorbed it, watch the puddles going away from me. Because that's a mechanical cue they can see.
Yeah.
They haven't got a natural kind of feel or grace.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, it's about finding the cue that works for that individual. So even though we go drive through the floor is our cue that works for 90% of the athletes, there might be 10% where it's some other cue of take off like a rocket ship. You know what I mean? Like there's different cues like that you've got to work through. So, but yeah, like you make a good point that, and I can take that from a prison. But I see all that. Like I would almost nearly put it under the, and stability is probably not the right title for that point. I would almost change that to connection. And that's what we start talking about. It's not just about what the core is doing, but are they connecting the mind and the body to get their body to do what you want it to do. Yeah. And if you figure out how to do that really well in young athletes, let me know. Make a lot of money on that.
I support your deep squat thing too, because part of going basketball is to get the weight counterbalance between the all handle and your butt. So your butt will be right on the seat. Now if you can, one of the things I try to tell people is to get that feeling of hung. Once you've placed, it'll move a little bit, and that's where you can't stand on it when the blade's not even anchored. But if you put it in, it's anchored, and then so it's feel like you stand up in the boat, and you need that strength to be able to just move.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we talk about. So you can't get that feeling from a box. And it's not banging a box. We can definitely do, like we do some shorter range stuff as well. But yeah, like you've got to, if you can control 150 kilos on your back, butt to grass, just keep in mind that one please, Sarah. You are going to be able to hold that catch vision so you can hang off that and get that connection through the water much. Because you can't do that with your arms, this is still hard as well. Or we're going to get over too far forward on it, or we're not going to be, like, there's a number of things that can go wrong in that position. Cool. That's great, I love this. This is how I like it. Anything else? Anyone else? Any comments?
I'm not sure if you can mention it later in the slide, but just on the range of motion kind of question, it links to like injury prevention stuff.
Yeah.
Like that.
I don't think I did. We might as well talk about it now.
Yeah, it wasn't sure if you had it later.
I don't think I'd go through it into too much detail on any slides specifically.
Kind of like control responsibility efforts compared to like the
Yeah.
action mode, you know, like you
Yeah.
one or the other like controls it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like what's one of the biggest? What are the two biggest injuries in rugby? Back and rib. Okay. So ribs is a bit of a funny one. It can be multitude of factors. It can be loading. There's other things we can work on there. But back in particular is often more about the position that they're in on a repetitive stroke. So if we're able, as we were saying there, we can teach them to move in an effective pattern first, then load that, then pulling the oars and pushing the boat should not become too much of an issue for them, and reduces that chance that we'll pick up one of those overuse injuries or something like that. Yeah, like we can never say we'll get rid of them, but it's protecting them against the risk of that happening. Because my eyes is that we're always pushing the limits of their physical capacities in the gym, on the water, because we want the best out of them. And so, you know, injuries are going to happen, but can we either reduce the risk, reduce the severity of it happening? Which, if you can move through a greater range of motion with control, but with force and power, with acceleration, you're less likely to get a really massive injury, particularly from an overuse point of view. But then on the flip side is, if it does happen, are we strong and capable enough to come back from it quicker? So instead of spending 6 months out of the boat, can we be back in 4 to 6 weeks, whatever that might be? Yeah. Did that kind of go down and around? Yeah. Like, I mean, to me, I go strong athletes are healthy athletes. Yeah. Very rare that you see the strong guys get injured, but it does happen. So you can't just go, they're strong and they'll never get injured. But I mean, we can anecdotally say that we know athletes that are constantly getting injured, and we know that if we look at them generally, they're either just not strong, or they move weight, but not in an effective manner, because that's the other tying in of it. So it's even not just can we go through range, but are we going through that range in an effective and efficient manner? Yeah. Because anyone can put weight on their bar and get their butt to the ground, but can they come back up out of it? Yeah. Because most roles I work with have decent range of motion. There's little bits and pieces they need to work on, but as far as compared to other athletes that I've worked with, as we said, the nature of the sport is getting to a deep position and come back out. Yeah.
Also, Simon, like
with, I was going to change the slide.
S&C, you know, it's like doing a drill in the water and you're providing an exaggerated load. You know, it's if you're always specific, you just row all the time. You know, like you have to overload to create a stimulus to make a change, and so really challenging deeper positions than you might actually go to. I think, as Simon said, you're not always doing like before. You might be loading higher, like exaggerating the load again, even higher to create a stimulus at a half depth. But I think generally it's a bit.
It tricks the body into recruiting more muscle fibers.
Yeah.
But you didn't know, if you're in
Now
the boat,
we're back to
you wouldn't realise, but when you do weights and you start to realise, actually, I've got a lot more strength than I thought.
Yeah. At the end of the day, everything comes back to this: is our brain recruiting enough motor neurons to get muscle fibers activating. If we work through a greater range of motion, we recruit more muscle fibers. That's the way it works. Yeah. And which is just where it comes back to. That's why, even just from that perspective, I know a deep squat should be part of the toolbox. Yeah. Cool. Great. I love that. We've moved on to this slide about 4 times now. But we've already touched on that, because it's not just about the weight movement. And this is something that's very important in my eyes, because force is effectively related directly to the amount of weight that we move. There's an acceleration component, but definitely the more weight we're moving, the more force we're producing. It's pretty basic physics. But it's, can we move that weight with intent? Because if it was just about how much weight we can move, then Arnie would have been a great rower. But that's not what it's about. It's about can that, and that's why when sometimes you look at some of the best rowers, and they're not always moving the most weight, but they move it really effectively. And that's really key that to me. And that's something I've had to take a couple of athletes that have come into our program, and I can say they haven't been from the ACT environment, they have been external, where we just readjusted some of the thought processes around. It's not just put more weight up, put more weight on, put more weight. Yes, we do want to do that over a period, but we want to make sure we're moving it efficiently and effectively through that full range and staying connected. It's like, I mean, everyone's seen people doing the deadlifts where it's set here and then it's just now, if you guys saw that in the boat, would you be happy or sad? Sad? Yeah, good. That's what we're looking at. That's what when we talk about connection, that's what we talk about. Like, you can move more weight by lifting it like that. But A, you're not being connected, so you're not going to then produce an optimal outcome from moving the boat fast, which is what was the goal of rowing, is move that boat fast. And then two, we're going to come back to putting themselves at risk of injury because we're moving in an inefficient pattern. So it's sometimes when, and this is where it's really hard when some people don't have the right direction or understanding of, they just see people lifting weights and they go out and lift weights and they're like, oh yeah, I've got to put more weight, I've got to put more weight, I've got to put more weight. But if we can move it more efficiently and effectively before loading, then load on that incrementally. And we're just trying to find that line where if we add a little bit extra load, it's going to break down. But then we just work on keeping it right, and then when they get that right, then we add a little bit more. Yeah. So again, this I've already talked about this. I mean, I am not about whether I put this slide in. I'm going to show the phases to the rowing coaches. Like, what am I even bothered? I mean, it's just more. Where did you get that? I can't remember where I got it. It's a good one, isn't it? You know how hard it is to just find good rowing? It's very hard. I could not find one.
Is this the new technical one?
Yeah. It was more to highlight that part on the end around like I've worked in a number of strength-based sports, athletics being one, rugby league, I did a couple of more, but one of the biggest things was, we never get into that position. Why are we squatting there? Well, I mean, even though it's not a great example, it's still like you can see from, if you compare that to the Joe Blow roller, like we get into those angles in those positions. And in my defence, it was on my laptop screen, so the pictures weren't as big as that roller. We'll move on from that one. Now this next slide might ruffle a few feathers. I know this might ruffle a few in the rowing world. And I've gone a bit hard on this, but it's just for me. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go for it. Hey.
Athletes that do this as well. Let's do 40 reps of 50 kilos. That's okay.
Yeah. And the thing I will say is that it's not that you can never do this, but my thought process is, in the gym, I'm never going to replicate the amount of volume and repetitions that you're going to replicate out there. So what am I doing by doing this? If I go back to everything that I spoke to in the last few slides around what the strength training should be achieving, this won't help us achieve that, yeah? Okay? So the gym shouldn't be used to, and this is going back a little bit to what you were talking about like the positioning and stuff like that. Just being really careful about my philosophy around strength training is either that it's all sport specific or none of it is. If that makes sense. So, like, we don't want to replicate the sport to the nth degree where we're like, we can't squat here because we broke here. Like, to me, I go, we're just trying to find the gaps that our sport-specific training can't fill, and that's our main priority of what we want to try and do. And Wesley elaborated on it a bit earlier around, it's about creating an overload to what they would typically, so realistically our training should be harder than what they do. Our training on both the gym and in the water and on the earth should be harder than what they do in a race. The race ideally should be the easiest thing that they do. Ideally. but it's not always that way. So, and again, this comes back to that point I probably highlighted earlier. Like, I see my goal to make one stroke the best stroke possible, so that we create, and again, it comes back to, if we can move through range with higher loads, we're creating a ceiling. And we're raising that ceiling so that whenever they're working at this point, it goes from being, 80% of their ceiling to 60%, because then what that gives us is that gives us more room to, and we just keep moving it like that. Okay? Cool. Does anyone else? Oh, yeah. Sorry, yes. Two, Jack.
Is there a role, like, when
Yep.
the racing season, and you're realistically not going to get stronger? A couple of, maybe a month later, you're not going to get stronger, right? But you could hit more.
Wait, sorry, I was going to let him finish.
Sorry. Alright.
No, finish your question.
Sorry. But you might get more explosive.
Yes.
Is there not a benefit to dropping the weight, increasing your reps, and looking for more speed?
Oh, okay. Yes, you have got ahead of the slides a little bit there. So, yes, but no, you are right.
It doesn't make crossover to strength and endurance.
Not so much strength and endurance, but power. This is probably where we're thinking of it a little bit of a different way.
Okay.
So, if I drop the weight and pick the speed up, I'm also probably dropping the reps as well.
Right.
And increasing the reps. Yeah. So we're looking at a force velocity continuum and a force velocity curve. Yeah. So the higher the force, the slower the movement.
Yeah.
The faster the movement, the lower the force.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're trying to figure out where now, if we look at sports, so if we go high velocity, low force, an example of that, probably the best example of that is swimming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like realistic. There's a lot of ground reaction forces, but they're moving really fast. There's no overall force happening. High force, weight. Yeah. I mean, they move that pretty fast still, like, too. So you can see how it's like not black and white out. So rowing sits like right in the middle. Like it's never truly high end velocity, but it's not true high end force.
Yeah.
It's one of those few sports where it's like every capacity is coming into play. Like every so the power work isn't so much about lightweight, but more about rate of force development. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've got your
Force velocity curve.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what
When you
you
work on,
Yep.
when you squat head,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
You're aiming to move that curve to get strong, more what?
To the
And you're expecting the shape of that curve.
Newtons. So that should be force newtons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you work on the top end power. Are you expecting, the relationship, or you expecting your ability to move weight, not move half that weight at a quicker speed to stay relatively the same if you're only working at the top end? Like you don't need to work on. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. I think probably the easiest way to answer that question is to say I don't think you never need to stop working and getting stronger. Okay. It's just about how you approach that. And now we're probably getting into the nitty-gritty of some of the prescription side of things, but we're talking about things like there's force where we go absolute force, okay, which is just purely the amount of newtons that you produce. Okay, but then there's relative force or relative strength. Easy way to think about that is probably a bit more like power weight ratio. Yeah. So it's not going, oh, we're doing force and then we're doing power. Yeah. It's like this. Okay. So if I give an example of how, like winter block season when we're working on max strength, my primary lift would be a squat or deadlift, and it's 5 reps. It's like within the constraints of like move well, move efficiently, but let's load the hell out of it. Yeah. We move to January Feb, coming into New South Wales Champs, National. The emphasis has gone that squat's not the primary focus of the session, but it's still there. Yeah. What I might have done is I've dropped the reps maybe down to 3. I've gone, we're going to work a little bit lighter and low, but we're going to maybe add a little bit of velocity-based training to that where we track the velocity on it. Yeah. But it's still heavy. It's still producing force. Okay. The focus on it might then move to power cleans, where we're now trying to work on a higher rate of force development. Okay. So we're not going, oh, we're done with winter. We're in competition, let's stop working on strength. Sure. Yeah. You can always improve strength as you can always improve everything. Like that's what I was also saying, like I won't not work on power in the winter, but it'll just be a different emphasis in a different part of the program where we're going, this is the main focus, that's what we make.
Okay.
And they're all designed to interconnect over a period. They're not to go, this is one and this is the other. This is more where we're talking about, like, we're going to do 200 bench pulls, we're going to do 200 strokes. Okay? That's kind of where that's sitting, yeah. But again, it comes back to here. My goal is to make one stroke as quality as possible, and then we just try to make every preceding stroke as close to that as humanly possible. Yeah. There you go. So, hold on, Raj.
Sorry, I'm going back to Pete's start. Just the point with Jim should be used to replicate work. Nigel probably, I saw Paul Nelson in the 80s and 90s in Europe or whereabouts, and he basically took a lot of the standard gym exercises and actually tried to put a spin on them from what it actually trying to replicate what would happen in a boat which is unstable.
Mm-hmm.
Give you an example. So instead of like bench pressing, which most of the kids basically lift the thing, they arch back, you would have a bench press where you basically lift your feet off the ground, you would have one dumbbell, and you would lift the dumbbell on that. And what his argument was basically engage all the core, you're also pushing stability or whatever. And I remember seeing guys basically, they were able to dumbbell 15, 20, 25 kilos. So, So on that, like, so you anti all that?
No, 100% no. No, that's like, so
his argument was basically that bench press technique or exercise is basically replicating in that you're engaging your core in actually doing that lift.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going.
So you don't have the stability of your feet on.
So the way I look at that though, is I go, I can see he's tying it into the sport, but that specific exercise, let's just use that exercise as an example, that's not sport specific because you never rode one arm. Your feet are attached to something.
Yeah, but you do.
But the purpose of working this is sport specific.
Okay.
Yeah. So that 100% I'm on board with. So if you go back to what he changed of like bench pressing and they arch the back, 100% I hate that. If you arch your back when you bench press, you're no longer transferring force through your body, you're just changing your body position to get more weight out.
And you would have basically people doing cleans on an unstable environment. So basically
that's probably where it started. And the only thing I would say about that, the only thing, and look, when we talk about strength training, there's elements that they've been doing for hundreds of years. And they work. They're 100% right. But also, to caveat that, I would say, if we go back to the 80s, for example, just generally speaking, we don't do everything that we did in the 80s, we don't do now. So it's just that some things have changed as they've gone deeper into the research. And I'm not saying what the example you gave was wrong. That actually, I do give the guys single arm dumbbell bench presses at certain points potentially, depending on what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. But they also bench press. But they power clean. Unstable surfaces, it's just that the research. But just so that.
So what I'm saying, he basically took all your standard weightlifting exercises and tried to put a spin on them from.
No, and that's innovation, and there's nothing wrong with that. The only reason I'm going to just do it is like for potentially anyone that's watching it later, is that the problem with the unstable surfaces the research is suggesting that doesn't actually improve their ability to control their body. It actually just puts them at more risk of hurt themselves, and that you actually just be better off just doing single leg or single arm. So that's where like the bench press is probably better. Like that was a good example. So I'm definitely not against that, and that's the way that we try to challenge that. So the only thing that we probably don't do it as much in rowing is just like I probably do more of that stuff for the sweepers rather than for the sculls, just because they do have that more dominant side that they tend to sweep on. So I create a bit more of that cross-link. Well, I call it cross-link, and so we're working that sling across the body and the ability to control the body. So don't get me wrong, I'm definitely not against that stuff at all.
We used to do something for a bench pull and that was the same, so unstabilised there. So so you weren't actually over the thing. Right?
No, that's fine. And look, and probably one of the points I'll make later on is that if I was to actually go deep into everything we could possibly do and possibly work on, like we wouldn't be able to do. I actually didn't check the time, about an hour. there's so many different ways to achieve something. It's just figuring out the best way that it suits the athletes that you're working with, the situation and logistics that you want to work with, and then the level that you're at and they're at and everything's at. So it's not saying that necessarily everything's always wrong or everything's always right. But is it right for right now? And that's probably the biggest thing. And that's the biggest thing most people miss when they do their strength training is that they see someone else do it and they go, oh, that's what I need my 15-year-old rollers to do. But if we're talking, sorry, I've forgotten his name, but the guy back in the 80s, my guess would be is he was probably a pretty strong dude as well already. So you've got to go, can we build the foundations first and then get them to the point where they're able to do that. So just got to give just a little more, then I'll continue going. Sorry, but if there's any more questions, keep asking, obviously. Did that answer the
No, it's fine.
Yeah. We come across this today, so I thought I'll just chuck it in. Just saying, maximum strength physique, rowing performance in elite female rowers, particularly on the erg. I just highlighted the conclusions of this study. The reason I didn't put the abstract in is because you can't actually access the study yet. But it does seem to say that squat 1RM, deadlift 1RM, and power clean 1RM were the strongest determinants of rowing ergometer performance in female elite rowers and recommended for training and testing. So the research is tending to back a lot of what I'm already saying anyway. But again, it's going, yes, these are important movements, but that's where we may have the supplementary stuff of where we could potentially have something like that single arm dumbbell bench press as an accessory exercise to hit the target of the connection. Or it might be a trunk exercise. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways that you can put stuff together. So I just wanted to touch on this bit as well, just because I know Leslie was keen for me to talk about this. Periodization, that's like a point as well. I had to actually double check where that actually originally came from because I'd forgotten, but it's from Mice and Men, if anyone wants to know. So yeah, key athletic traits. We have a robust athlete. Can we build their maximal strength and can we transfer that into explosive power? Okay. We tend to move through the traits as the season progresses. So this is going back to what we were talking about a little bit ago. So earlier in the season, we might have a higher robustness focus, touching on max strength with maybe a sprinkling of explosive power. As we move into the middle of the year, we're really starting to shift towards a max strength, but maybe touching on just keeping that robustness element in there, and then maybe touching on a little bit of explosive power. Then as we probably get to a bit more of the pointy end of the season, and we want to see with more of the results, we start to shift more to explosive power, but touching on max strength, maybe that's where the robustness might disappear for a little bit, depending on the individual. But basically, we're looking for something with the highest neural output and the smallest level of fatigue, closest to priority events. And so that's where we're talking about the power stuff. So we're creating the highest rate of force development with the least amount of fatigue, which when we talk about strength endurance, we're creating fatigue. So we want to create that high power output without fatigue. Because they're doing enough of both, it's going to fatigue. Yeah? Training age will dictate the priorities for strength development. Younger athletes should be doing less of this and more of this. And then as they get better, they then transition. It's not saying they shouldn't do any of it, but it's also very basic and simple as well at the same time. Like, I'm talking about power cleans, but jump. Yeah, like keep it simple, keep the movement pattern and quality, but work on making them a really good athlete. Move well through a good range of motion, but then you've got young athletes that'll take to it like a duck to water, and they'll progress quicker. And then you'll have some of them that are moving like baby giraffes, and you've just got to take your time. So you've got to give and play, but you've got to make, and so I specifically put training age because it's not chronological age. Yeah? Just like in a boat, if you get an older person start to get into a boat at a later age, and by older I just mean potentially a late adolescent or early 20s, their training age is the same in the gym. Their training age is, they still need the basics right first before you progress into the more complex. And me and Wesley discussed this last point today already. Ideally, I try to match up the light weeks on water with their deload weeks in the gym. So when they're light and off, they're off. So they can recover, they can adapt, then we can progress. Yeah? I've got hard weeks are hard, but you don't necessarily have to match. I wouldn't, when we were discussing this today, we probably wouldn't look to match up their hardest week in the gym with their hardest week on water. We'd maybe offset them by a week potentially, just so you're not absolutely cooking them. Yeah, but I would try and match up their light weeks in the gym with the water, or on the herbs, where we are.
How many weeks do you do those? 3 week, 4 week, 5 week?
I don't on average 4,
Yeah.
but it's basically when Westy gives me the important events, he gives them to me. I work backwards from that and then just kind of divide them up as evenly as I can. But generally, I use my rough plan would be medium, heavy, medium deadlift, or medium, heavy deadlift, depending on what. It'll depend on what Westy's got planned on.
So there's heaps of those different structures that work, and I tend to use variety. You rather than just always doing the same thing, you know, gets stale, the progression gets halted, limited. So for example, this next, and I'm going to share this with a community that's working on the blueprint at the moment, right through September. You know what we do anyway, and then it's a 4 week. They're 4 week blocks between now and the Oceania Championships and any potential retrialing of the national team early August, late July. A lot of that is actually just there's a number of factors. It's probably worth it. It's probably almost an entire other session to be honest.
It's only one slide.
And I would be really interested to share this sort of stuff with you guys. But then, anyway, going back to the point, I think sometimes like you know 4s, we will do 4s, and then it will go into 5s or 6s, where it's so the light week to the high week in the 4s might be a steeper staircase if you like, and then in the 5s it gets flat, but the light week stays a little bit higher. Maybe the top week is what might be actually the same as the 4 because you progress that. You know, so you keep a more consistent load over a longer period before you give them an adaptation, and that then is a different stimulus to elicit a new adaptation.
I think the thing I've found is that you don't necessarily always have to plan that. It just happens from the calendar.
Right.
Because it's never perfect 4 week increments that thing. Like if we just look purely from time trials, like they're at the end of the months, but months don't work in perfect 4 week blocks. Yeah. So sometimes it just happens anyway. My general rule is I wouldn't make anything smaller than 3 weeks, but I wouldn't go any more than 6 weeks. But rules are always going to be broken too, so we're going to say no. But that's general.
I'm just coming on that. That's true. So in this instance, the 4's working really well with some of the other factors that we want to try and you know, the winter time trial series are every 4 weeks.
Yeah.
We want to try and
Roughly.
but so actually using those as a factor, so that for example, and we're going to do an ergo a 5K ergo every Tuesday leading into the winter time trial. Then there's a level of consistency and routine, so that for example, every time they turn up to that, they're roughly in the same level of of phase of their training block, whereas as opposed to doing one in a light week and then one in a heavy week and then one in a, you know, which you get if you go too far away from your calendar or your key events. But it doesn't mean that you always have to be primed and tapered and ready to go for, you know, your ergo or your event. But there's some advantage to having some routine, some continuity. If, for example, in this instance, it's an opportunity for me to go, I really want them to develop their a passion for and an enthusiasm and an awareness for doing the ergos better. So setting them up for a little bit for success and some consistent repeat efforts in that.
So this is an example I put together of a yearly plan previously. I haven't done one like this in a number of years. This is usually what I put together when I don't get anything from a coach. And so this is not Westy, so we can be clear about that. But it breaks down like you can just see how I've kind of, so it's worked off a calendar year, but we know that kind of the rowing year doesn't really work like that. You can kind of see we have the shaded blocks as the volume, the red lines, the intensity, so you can sort of see the winter block, the volume's a little higher, the intensities are a little bit lower, and as we start to prep, the intensities start to pick up, the volume start to drop, but they're not, the biggest point I want to make with that is that they're not even, they're not the same, they don't look the same every time, so they climb and change depending on what and if there's one thing rowing loves to do, it's a good test, so it's figuring out which tests are the important ones and which ones we want to be prepped for, and which ones we can train true to a degree. So it's just playing around with what's important to you and how you want to lead into those blocks. Generally, I just go, if I'm hitting 8 weeks, I just split into a 4-week block. 6 weeks, I have gone 7 weeks, and it was just purely because I was like, well, let's get a couple extra heavier weeks in block, but sometimes I normally split that into a 3 and 4 week block. Cool. So, there you go, there's a nice little transition. Overview. Many ways to skin a cat. I know Peter would hate that, but that's okay, that's what he's doing that. Everything I've said today is a general overview, but there's always exceptions to what I'm talking about. There's always logistics and reasons why something might not work or has to be done a different way. And there's a theoretical way to achieve everything, but the biggest thing I've learned in my time being an S&C coach, and particularly in rowing, is that we've got to work with what's not optimal theoretically, or what's optimal logistically with what we have in front of us. Yeah? Okay? Otherwise, we're not going to create adaptations anywhere. So there's many ways to skin a cat, but at the end of the day, can they squat and can they deadlift well? Those are my 2 biggest things. If I ever had an athlete come to me that can't do those things, that's where I'm spending most of my time trying to rectify. Yeah? And from my point as being a high performance S&C, that's not what I want to be spending my time. So to anyone listening here and online, if you can get them to squat well from a movement capacity, that makes my job much easier when they come see me. One thing we didn't really talk about is the upper body, but I think it's important just to rush on that. Just like they need to have a strong upper body, obviously, to finish the stroke as well. So it's strong legs is where the power originates from. Strong core creates a connection, but then we've got to have the strong body at the end of the stroke to finish through the oars. So it's all got to be worked hard, connected, worked well. Effective use of the core to connect those upper and lower bodies, and that's where, if we have time, which he still wants to go through it, I guess, around like some of the stuff he's doing, he's from the NTC, which I'm totally on board with, but he's already got the resources, so then it's less work for me to create something, but I think it's a really vital part of it, okay? Move efficiently and effectively first, then loaded, and my goal is to build an athlete so that Wesley can create a rower. That's what your strength training should be. Questions? We've had heaps of questions, but are there any other specific questions anyone wants to go over quickly before maybe Wesley takes over?
One thing, after your opinion, about 20 years ago, I was at the library at the Sports Commission.
Yep.
Going through rowing stuff. And I found this study, and what they did was to break in the league. This is for elite athletes. For winter training, they broke the squad into 2 groups. One of them did all rowing over winter.
Yep.
The other one did a combination of rowing and weight training over winter. This is a proper study. There's a scientific study apparently. I can't recall the details.
Yep.
Right? The outcome was that at the end of the winter training, both teams had the same strength. But the VO2 max was quite different. The rowing group had a lot higher than the group that did weights. And I'm not saying they did weights exclusively. I don't mean that. I have no recollection of the details. But their VO2 max was reduced. I was just wondering if. So that's the league run, so that doesn't really play in what we're talking about.
So there's probably a couple of things. I don't expect you to remember all the details. I barely remember all the details of most of the studies I read. But there is some devil in the details. So it depends on how that was run, who specifically were the athletes. Like, not saying that they weren't elite, but were they already strength trained? Were they not? Like, because the biggest thing you find is that if someone has no history of strength training, you don't have to do much strength training and they will take off. But if they're highly strength trained already, which I would go out on a limb and say potentially in the elite rowers, they probably had some history of strength training and then you just took it away and then they rode. Okay, yeah, they probably would get a higher VO2 max after back at that intervention. But also too, I would imagine it was probably like a 6 or an 8 week block, probably. It's the way most of them go. I doubt very highly it was a 12-month intervention. So my question would be, well, what does that look like at the end of 12 months if they stop strength training? Because you can maintain your strength for a certain level of time anyway. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, and that's where you've got to be able to understand the research and the study to go, okay, well, this is why this might happen. And again, it's different to what probably the calibre athletes we're really talking about now as well. But you always come across it like, I mean, how many rowers in the NTZ, like they're successful rowers, like I don't strength train. Well, that's because you're a very efficient and effective rower and move really well, and you're actually already naturally strong. But if you're not, then strength training is going to help you. And generally, I would imagine most of those guys anyway have done some strength training at some point. There are some genetic freaks, but we can't work off the outliers. We've got to work off the broader general population and demographic that we work with. And I've seen a lot of that kind of stuff as well. But it's a bit hard to say exactly without knowing exactly what goes on in that. But that would be my guesstimate of maybe that's why those things occurred. I would imagine I probably already strength trained and they just took it away for 6 to 8 weeks and they stopped strength training and they rode more. They got makes sense. But would that continue on? Okay. Which it might have been a long one, I don't know. But yeah, it's hard to say without knowing what that one was. That would be kind of my take on it. Elites harder because they're often already. There's a reason why they're elite already. So, sorry, I couldn't give you a more.
That's fine.
More.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
I was interested in the actual study and the results of that. So
Yeah, well, look.
I think you answered that really well. To be honest, is I think there is the considerations what you're talking about there, and then there are unintended consequences always of going and doing or something like that, as you say, and it might be 12 months down the road before you find out what those are. I think in general, we want our athletes to be strong and like the core principles of what you're talking about. But there are great examples whereby, for example, you're trying to elicit a change in a highly trained person or somebody that's coming up, and you might decide that actually that is their greatest area of opportunity is we're going to grow more, and we're not going to worry about the strength training because it's not the limiting factor for that person at the moment, and in fact they'll probably maintain their strength by doing extra rowing, and maybe we throw a resistance band on, and do some resistance training in that way. But you whatever you're doing in training, you're trying to overcome a limitation and grow a capacity or develop another one, and so I think
It is
rather
something.
than just saying, well, strength training is not important for others.
I think that's what it is.
No, I know, but that's.
But what you'll find is that will be the argument for some people, and I guess if I was then to counter that argument, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, is I go, at the end of the day, the boat needs to be the fastest boat on the water. I think that's not an argument we can argue against. Like, you can't win a race if you're not the fastest. So, and I'm not saying that anyone's ever achieved it, but there's got to be a point where a VO2 max has a diminishing return on the result, if that makes sense. So, because it's not about how long you can race for. So, I guess it's kind of just coming back to saying is what is their limiting factors? And so, probably in that cohort, the strength wasn't their limiting factor. But at the end of the day, it's got to be about getting to the end of the finish line as fast as you possibly can. How you do that is a technical, tactical element. But yeah, it's a question I've often asked within, particularly coming originally from not from a rowing background, but from other sports, around do we do too much of it? I'm not saying is it the right or wrong way, but that's just I see it also that as my job as the S&C to question that, just to go, well, have we thought about it this way? And so that would be my counter argument to probably the result of that. I'm going, well, just because they improve their VO2, does that make them a better rower? Like, often it does, but those guys, did they need to improve their VO2? Maybe increasing their strength would have made them a better rower. But they'll probably all gold medal winners if it was an 80s and 90s study, I guess. Probably Lawson Forson or something, who I know have been very historically never didn't do much strength training. But again, genetic freaks. So yeah. Cool. Anything else? Did you want to go through your course quickly?
Look, I would, but we'll end up being here for quite a bit longer if I put my presentation on with it, and so I won't subject you guys to that. No. So just before I touch on that, I just want to say thanks very much to Simon. I really, I thought it was really thought-provoking, and you could see the quest was stimulating in terms of the multiple different ways to go about it, the different philosophies, and it's a really interesting area. Something that I think is really important, especially for our developing athletes. I think that definitely makes them faster. To your point, I was going to talk about core strength specifically, or trunk strength, what is core versus trunk. And it's really, I guess, it's multifaceted. I'll talk about, I've got some study details around lower back pain, and an incredibly high percentage of young rowers have back pain at some point in their life. And at the time of one of these studies, I think it's 60-something% of those rowers at that point in time had current back pain and so on. So it's something that we all encounter with the rowers that we have. And one of the ways in which, rowing is not natural in many ways. So our spine is meant to flex and move and all the rest of it, but we want to use it like a rigid lever to transfer force from, our increasingly strong leg drive and to our arms and the handle. So how we make sure that we get our bodies into the right positions, and then how we brace in those positions is really important. Like, Simon was talking about, his job and our job as coaches, and the difference between, say, for example, lifting, being able to do a really decent weight in the gym, squatting or deadlifting, versus being able to hold a strong, safe, effective, connected position in the boat for 2 hours while we go through a 20+ K training session, let alone a 6-minute race, is often a fair way apart. You can see people doing, I can think of lots of examples of athletes, and I'm sure you all can too, where they can get into those positions and they can do it for 5 to 8 reps, but then by the end of 10 minutes they look like this, and they're rowing half slide. And so that's another level, it's another capacity, and that we need to develop. So, and we put a lot of energy, we started the centre. And I think it was a huge part of our success in the early years. Like we had a really good impact with some, again, highly trained growers who, in our opinion, didn't transfer the force that they had, into the vote effectively. And so through some design around specific intervention with the core circuits and so on, we were able to sort of really increase their capacity. So what I'll do is I'm happy to do it on another one of these sessions. I'm also happy to share the information I've got. But I guess in short, one of the things that I'm trying to do with our group, and one of the things that I would like to offer to the broader community within our pathways athletes, the ones that are aspiring for state representation, for national team representation, is to provide like a core circuit each week. We do it probably. The details to be coming, but it'll be more of an open invitation for people that are, for athletes that are interested in learning a bit about positional awareness, like which muscles they need to be able to develop and hold isometric control, strength and stability, flexibility, and then some of the exercises that they can do, both pre-session, at home.
I think probably just one thing I would like to add, that just to strengthen what she was talking about there, is that it ties back into what the premise of what I was talking about earlier, of you can't just go out and do core work. So some people will hear that and go, oh, that's going out and doing 1,000 crunches. It's not about getting the abs. Your core is this. So a big thing, like a good example of something, like we all know what a prone hold plank bridge is, I'm thinking. We've also built where people are doing that and they're hanging off their spine in the middle of that, but they're holding it for 5 minutes. Like that's, like, as an S&C and a coach, we'd rather see a 30-second hold where they're, like that pelvis is, like that's what we're talking about the positioning, is that their pelvis is in the right position, and then they can hold that rather than just the absolute amount of time that they can hold a position, if that makes sense. I think it's just important to always reiterate that it's like, yes, all these things are important, but they need to be done well. Otherwise, all you're doing is training bad habits. And what does the body go back to when it's fatigued? What it knows, which is often bad habits. So if we can replace more bad habits with good habits, when they're fatigued, they should be able to hold better positions, or at least get back to them quicker as well.
So and that's the big part of it. It is something that requires education, and they really do have to learn what the positions are to be able to, and what they're trying to achieve. And going into Simon's point, like when you look at a diagram of our musculature, and you have a look at the multiple directions at which our outer abdominals, inner abdominals, and the whole trunk, they go in every single different plane and direction and tying in here. And so in order to be effective with what we're doing, we have to do anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion. We have to do anti-rotation. We have to do rotation, to do hip extension. These are a range of exercises that need to be carried out to be as effective as we possibly can in that stroke, and to prevent things like back pain. Anyway, but I'm mindful of how long we've got, so all right. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.